Hi class, this is ICOM 212, Digital Image Design. I told you earlier in the semester that in this class we would do three things. First, we would learn about visual rhetoric, or the study of the messages and intents behind images and designs. Visual rhetoric also, of course, deals with creating messages and intents behind images and designs, emphasizing that designs and images can communicate and that you ought to figure out what you want to say before you create a design or image. And then I promised second to teach you a common visual language, that is, aesthetic elements like color, shape, and typography that go into images and designs that lead audiences to the author's intended message. And finally, I promised to show you the software tools that you'll need to employ the visual language in a design in order to communicate your rhetoric. This week, having learned about rhetoric, we move on to the visual language. So, how do we create aesthetic beauty and develop a message through our design? We have to choose design elements that help to communicate the message, and then we have to organize and arrange them to make relationships between them apparent. Learning what the elements are and how to use them is like learning a new language. The design elements are the basic building blocks of a visual composition. The elements themselves and their relationships to one another imply meaning. That's a statement that should be familiar to you if you've been following along with the class so far. Design elements consist of tangible elements, shape, space, line, texture, and type, and conditional elements, color, value, size, volume. Tangible elements are things that can exist on their own. You can have a letter or a circle, for example. Conditional elements are conditions or values of those things, like a red circle or a giant letter. I'm not going to spend time on going over what these elements are because it's explained really well in the readings with examples that you need to look at and study, so don't just skip over the pictures in the book. I don't think the elements themselves are things that will confuse you. Instead, I'd like to show you how to use the design elements because that's really what's hard about elements. The shapes, space, line, texture, type, and colors that you use contribute to the overall message of the design. I'll bet this was apparent to many of you in last week's music video assignment. The thing to remember about how these elements send a message, however, is that they are used in different contexts. It's important then to remember that how you mix and match the elements also sends a message. And we'll look more at that next week when we look at design principles, which are principles to follow when designing visual compositions. But we can get into it a little bit this week. Take a look at this title card, for example. Look at the shapes, the color of those shapes, the type, etc., all of the elements in this title card. What is the message here, and how are we supposed to feel about A Nightmare on Elm Street? The design elements and how they are used tell us. So I think it's pretty easy to see how this week's material bridges with last week's material and the week before, visual rhetoric. The background blood splatter takes the color, texture, and splatter pattern of blood, emphasizing that this is a bloody horror film. The red is very, very bright, or what we call high chroma, which not only matches the color of fresh blood, but also contrasts highly with the background. So our attention is focused on that blood color and not the background. In fact, everything that has a shape here is blood colored. There is no other color, putting a lot of emphasis on blood and again suggesting that this is a very, very bloody movie. The type is actually slightly out of focus. I'm not sure if you can see that in this video, but the type isn't crisp. It's a little bit blurry. So that something is just barely off. The fact that something is just barely off about it is somewhat noticeable. Well, what else is blurry in horror films? Well, a lot of horror films use blurriness. Sometimes when the monster shows up, it's like on a blurry tape. Or sometimes entire scenes are somewhat blurry because we're seeing the scene from the perspective of a character whose eyes are teary or who's running. And finally, the typeface itself is what we call a serif typeface, meaning it has these little tick marks on the ends of letters. And these particular tick marks are pointy, like knives, which you will see in this film. So how about this logo? What is the message here? Let me ask you this. What do you think this logo is for? And what do you think the viewer is supposed to believe about that organization? Now, how did you know that? You knew because of the design elements and how they're used. If we look at the shapes in this logo, they are exclusively pointy. Even the little cheekbone of the horse isn't rounded, but rather more pointy. The horse's hair is pointy like daggers, and the motion lines on the bottom are also pointy. The ears are pointy. The horse is frowning and squinting its eyes. The horse is angled forward like it's running. The type is all caps, like yelling. The color of the type is yellow, like fire. So we have elements like shape, line, and type, and then conditions of them, like color and size. I think you would be surprised to now learn that this logo is for a church group. Why is that a surprise? Because nothing about the way it looks sends messages you would expect from a church, like messages of faith, peace, love, piety, and so on. The church recognized that this design did not fit with their message and had the logo redesigned to this. Now, take a moment to think about what the elements here are and how they send a message. I'll give you some hints. One thing I'd like to point out is that these two logos also serve to show how you can send messages based on the relationships between the elements in the design. In the first example, the horse blends into the waves, making the horse appear much bigger and emphasizing the dangerousness of the horse and therefore the brand as a whole. In this redesign, the waves across the bottom are now on top of the horse, and they're actually separated from it. They're a different thing. They're actual reins controlling the horse and suggesting domesticity. The final example I want to look at is this one, because it relies heavily not just on design elements, but those same elements as part of an image. The design to the left uses an image with conditional design elements in it, like color. Unfortunately, in this case, that color is one that reminds us less of what comes out of a dairy cow's udders and too much of what comes out of some other part of the cow. That is to say, I'll bet a few of you don't want to drink the milk from this cow. But on the right, we see the same thing, a dairy cow, presented in better light. The colors are the animal's colors, black and white, and not this awful muddy brown from the left. We can see the animal's expression. We can see the texture of its clean fur. And the design elements around it, the type and background color, match it. The type is more cutesy, with big curves to the letters, and it's black type on a white background to match the cow.